Nolan's training made Mark a hero. Conquest's training would have made him something else entirely, something more dangerous, more efficient, and a lot harder to root for. The question of what Mark Grayson becomes if the person teaching him how to fight is a 5,000-year-old sadist who considers mercy a character flaw is one of the best questions you can ask about this show, because the answer isn't simple, and it doesn't go the way most people expect. In the actual show, Nolan's approach to training Mark is almost comically low effort. He throws him around a bit, tells him to push against the air, catches him when he nearly hits the ground. The lessons are short, physically demanding, and nearly emotionless. Nolan is running an infiltration mission and raising a son at the same time, and the training reflects that tension. He gives Mark enough to function as a superhero, enough to build the cover story, but he's not just trying to produce a warrior, he's trying to produce a credible Omni-Man successor to prove Earth was useful to the Viltrumite mission while fighting much he cared for his family. Conquest doesn't have that problem. He has no mission pulling him in two directions. He has no emotional attachment to Mark. He has no reason to hold back, no cover to protect or relationship to keep intact. If Conquest trained Mark, he would train him the way Conquest understands training, which is the way Conquest understands everything, as a process of breaking something down until only what's useful remains. Conquest doesn't believe in progression, he doesn't build from fundamentals, doesn't start slow, doesn't grade difficulty. His whole philosophy is that you find out what someone can do by putting them in situations that should end them and seeing what survives. 5,000 years of fighting have proven to him that the only training that matters is the kind that happens at the edge of death. Everything below that threshold is just exercise. So Mark's first session doesn't start with footwork or positioning or learning to read an opponent's posture. It starts with Conquest hitting him at almost full speed and watching what happens. Mark goes down fast, he goes down in a way that makes his early fights with Nolan look like sparring. Conquest hits harder than Nolan at the equivalent stage, operates with 5 times the experience, and doesn't have any of the emotional hesitation that slowed Nolan down in Chicago. When Mark hits the ground, Conquest doesn't check on him. He tells him to get up. He just wants to see if Mark will get up. A Viltrumite who stays down after the first hit isn't worth the time. Mark gets up. That's the first thing Conquest learns about him that matters. The second lesson doesn't come the next day. Conquest doesn't do schedules. He shows up when he decides to, hits Mark with whatever level of force he thinks is appropriate for where Mark is in his development, and leaves when he's seen enough. The unpredictability is deliberate. Nolan trained Mark at set times, which meant Mark could prepare himself mentally for what was coming. Conquest removes that option. You don't get to brace for Conquest, you get to respond to him. In the first month, he teaches Mark exactly 3 things. The first is how to absorb a hit from someone significantly stronger without going down. Not how to avoid it, how to take it and stay functional. Conquest does this by hitting Mark until Mark figures out how to position his body to distribute the force. It's painful and inefficient by any human coaching standard, and it produces results faster than anything Nolan ever showed him. The second thing is flight acceleration. Mark can fly from the beginning of the show, but he flies conservatively, like someone who learned to drive in a parking lot and then got handed the keys to something with considerably more engine than they're ready for. Conquest pushes him on speed, on direction changes at high velocity, on using the momentum of flight as a weapon rather than just a way to get somewhere. By the end of the first month, Mark's flight speed has increased in a way that surprises even him. The third thing Conquest teaches him has nothing to do with technique. It's simply this: finish fights, not win them, finish them. There is a difference, and it's the difference Conquest cares most about. Winning a fight can mean the opponent is incapacitated. Finishing a fight means the opponent is no longer a problem. Mark, as the show makes clear in season 1 and 2, has a habit of stopping short of finishing. He wins and then holds back. Conquest treats this as a critical error and says so every time he sees it. Here's what the training produces in the short term, and it's significant. Mark, in the show's actual timeline, spends his first 2 seasons learning through experience. He gets beaten, he recovers, he gets beaten again. The reactive adaptation that makes Viltrumite biology so extraordinary gradually upgrades his baseline each time he pushes past his limits, but the process is slow and largely unguided. He goes into most of his early fights with less tactical understanding than he should have, and survives through a combination of instinct, stubbornness, and the occasional moment of rage that unlocks output he can't sustain voluntarily. The GD EPA's numbers from Season 3 tell you what that slow process produced. 90 days of serious combat increased Mark's speed by 65%, his endurance by 70%, and his strength by 138%. Those numbers are extraordinary, and they're still slower than what Conquest-style training would produce, because Conquest doesn't give Mark normal combat conditions. He gives him constant pressure at the edge of what Mark can handle, with no recovery time built in, and the biology responds accordingly. Mark's body doesn't know it's being trained by someone who doesn't care if he lives. It responds to the stress the same way it always does, by rebuilding at a higher level each time. Within 6 months of Conquest-style training, Mark's numbers are significantly ahead of where they'd be at any equivalent point in the show. The Mark who walks out of that 6 months would beat the Mark who fought Conquest in Season 3 with relative ease. The biological trajectory has been accelerated in ways that can't be reversed, because Viltrumite biology doesn't walk back upgrades. You don't lose what the near-death experiences gave you just because the near-death experiences stopped. Mark keeps everything he earned even if he walks away from Conquest training tomorrow. Conquest doesn't just push Mark physically. He talks to him during the training, not the way Nolan talked to him, not with the warmth of a father trying to connect with a son he also happens to be lying to. Conquest talks to Mark the way Conquest talks to everyone, directly, without decoration, in the language of a person who has spent 5,000 years watching what works and what doesn't. He tells Mark that hesitation kills, not that it's a tactical weakness, that it kills. Every moment Mark spent in any of his actual fights trying to find a way out that didn't involve hurting someone, every time he tried to talk before he threw a punch, every second of deliberation mid-fight, Conquest reads all of that as a death wish. He tells Mark that caring about the people around you in a fight is the fastest way to lose. When caring creates openings. An opponent who knows you'll hesitate to protect a civilian will use that every single time. Mark spent most of Season 1 and 2 getting used exactly that way, by people who understood it before he did. Conquest understands it better than anyone, and Mark, being 17 years old and raised by a man who turned out to be the villain of his own story, is in exactly the psychological state that makes these lessons land wrong. The version of Mark, who finds out Nolan's been lying to him for his entire life and then gets handed to Conquest for training, is a person whose entire framework for what heroism means has just been destroyed. He trusted Nolan, Nolan tried to kill him. Now Conquest is telling him that trust is a liability. He's not wrong. That's the problem. Mark at 17 desperately wants something to replace the framework that just collapsed. Nolan gave him one, and it turned out to be built on a lie. Conquest is offering another one, and this one has the advantage of not requiring Mark to believe in anything he can't see and test. Hit things hard enough and the problem goes away. Don't let your feelings slow you down. The only thing that matters is whether you're still standing at the end. That's a compelling alternative to trust your father. He's the greatest hero on Earth. What makes it specifically dangerous is that Conquest delivers it without any obvious agenda. Nolan wanted something from Mark, and that wanting eventually showed through the cracks. Conquest doesn't want anything from Mark in the personal sense. He wants to produce a competent Viltrumite. He's direct about it. The transparency of his intentions, the fact that he says exactly what he thinks without decoration, reads to Mark as honesty in a way that Nolan's warmth never did, because Nolan's warmth was always sitting on top of something hidden. Everything Conquest tells Mark about combat is technically correct. Hesitation does cost you. Emotional attachment to bystanders does create exploitable openings. The willingness to absorb punishment to protect someone else does reduce your effective combat output. These are real tactical truths that Mark eventually learns through painful experience in the show's actual timeline. Conquest is just delivering them earlier, and without any of the context that makes them survivable as lessons. The show's actual Mark learns that protecting people costs him something in a fight, but he also lives the experience of what it means to protect them successfully. He holds the line for the people behind him, and he carries the weight of the ones he couldn't reach. He watches Cecil sacrifice and calculate and manipulate, and he decides that's not who he wants to be. He watches Nolan break under the weight of what happens when you stop letting humans matter to you, and he decides that's not who he wants to be either. He builds his values through contrast and experience, and the specific texture of what it feels like to be Mark Grayson in a world that keeps trying to reshape him. William matters to that process. Amber matters, Debbie matters, even the conversations Mark has with Cecil that he resents in the moment matter because they keep forcing him to articulate what he believes rather than just react to what's in front of him. Mark's moral development in the show isn't something that happens in private. It happens in relationships. The people around him are the ongoing argument for why protecting people is worth the cost cost, and he keeps getting reminded of that argument through the specific experience of caring about specific people and seeing what caring for them produces. Conquest Trained Mark doesn't get that process at the same pace. He gets the tactical lessons without the lived moral experiences that would teach him why the tactics aren't the whole answer. He becomes more efficient and less certain about what efficiency is supposed to serve. And the people who might have provided that certainty, like William, Amber, Eve, even Cecil in his difficult way, are interacting with a version of Mark who's slightly harder to reach, slightly more behind glass than the one they know in the actual show. 6 months in, Conquest starts testing him differently. He stops just hitting Mark and starts putting him in scenarios. 2 opponents simultaneously, one going for Mark and one going for a bystander. Opponents who target the people around Mark specifically to see if he breaks position to protect them. Situations where protecting the person behind him means taking a hit that would end a less durable fighter, and where the smarter tactical choice is to take the hit on his own terms rather than chase the distraction. These scenarios are where the training gets morally complicated, because the right answer in combat terms and the right answer in human terms aren't always the same thing. Protecting the bystander costs Mark position and sometimes costs him the fight. Maintaining position keeps him in the fight, but means the bystander takes damage he could have prevented. Conquest runs these scenarios over and over until Mark stops making the reactive, emotional choice and starts making the evaluated tactical one. Mark starts making the tactical choice more often. He stops breaking position for civilians the way he used to. He starts calculating who he can protect most efficiently rather than trying to protect everyone at once. He's faster and colder, and by Conquest's measure, improving, but something else is happening underneath that. Mark is also getting angrier, not at Conquest, who is entirely consistent and transparent about what he's doing, at the scenarios themselves, at the fact that the world keeps putting him in situations where someone has to get hurt no matter what he chooses. That anger is going somewhere, and where it goes depends on which version of this story you're telling. In the darker version, it curdles. Mark starts resenting the scenarios rather than learning from them. He begins treating the people in them less as people and more as variables that keep complicating the calculation. The anger at being put in impossible positions becomes a kind of numbing, the same numbing that Conquest himself went through somewhere across 5,000 years, until the people in the scenarios stop registering as people and start registering as elements of the problem. In the hopeful version, the anger stays sharp and pointed. Mark gets faster and colder in the fight itself, but the anger at what the fight costs stays with him after. It motivates him to end fights quickly so fewer people get caught in them. It pushes him to get strong enough that he doesn't have to choose because he's capable of protecting everyone and winning simultaneously. The anger becomes fuel rather than erosion. That's the version of the training that produces someone formidable without producing someone broken. There's also the question of what Oliver looks like in this timeline, because his relationship with Mark is one of the things the show uses most directly to show Mark's capacity for care. In the actual show, Mark's relationship with Oliver is complicated and imperfect and real. Oliver comes to Earth as a child who grew up too fast with a Viltrumite's power and a child's emotional development, and Mark is the one who has to figure out how to be a brother to him while also managing everything else. He doesn't do it perfectly. He loses patience, he makes the wrong calls, but the relationship is clearly built on genuine feeling, and that feeling shows up in the fights where Oliver is in danger. Mark's response to Oliver being hurt is one of the most reliable triggers for his full output. Conquest Trained Mark would have a more complicated relationship with that instinct. He'd still care about Oliver, but he'd have been trained specifically to not let that care compromise his position in a fight. The tension between what the training tells him to do and what his instinct tells him to do would be sharper and more visible every time Oliver was on the line. It would push both of them into conversations the show's actual version of them doesn't have, because the show's Mark doesn't have the same conscious awareness of how his feelings about Oliver affect his combat decisions. There's a version of this training that produces something terrifying. A Mark who fights at the level the training accelerates him to, but has internalized the emotional framework that Conquest operates from, the belief that sentiment is a tactical liability and that the mission is the only thing that defines the right call. That version of Mark is one of the evil variants from the Invincible War, given a slightly different origin story. The show establishes clearly that Mark can go that way. Multiple alternate versions of him did. What stops the main timeline? Mark isn't his power level or his intelligence. It's the specific relationship relationships and experiences that keep pulling him back toward the person he chose to be. Under Conquest's training, those relationships don't get the same room to develop. Eve is the obvious example. In the show, Mark and Eve's relationship develops through shared experience, mutual vulnerability, the way she sees through his deflections and he sees through hers. It builds over time, and it's built on a version of Mark who is beneath all the deflection and the bravado, someone who lets people matter to him. That's the specific quality that makes the relationship work. Eve has spent her whole life around people who couldn't see past the surface. Mark sees past hers because he's not performing distance the same way. Conquest training. Mark doesn't prevent that relationship from existing, but it changes what Mark brings to it. A Mark who's been told for 6 months that emotional attachment creates tactical weakness is going to have a harder time letting someone in. He'll understand intellectually that Eve matters to him. He'll have more trouble showing it in the ways that sustain a relationship over time. Eve's power is, at its peak, potentially the most dangerous thing in the Invincible universe. The block on her ability to affect living matter is wearing down throughout the show. Conquest-trained Mark, who's been learning to assess threats and assets with a colder eye, might see that and try to manage it in a way that feels to Eve like being categorized rather than loved. That specific dynamic, Mark treating the people around him as variables, is exactly what the show warns against through Cecil. Eve would feel it before she could name it, and their relationship would have a fault line in it from earlier than it does in the actual timeline. Cecil is more interesting. Cecil and Conquest have something significant in common. They're both people who make decisions based on what the outcome requires rather than what the process feels like. Cecil uses people as assets. He calculates acceptable losses, he does terrible things, and tells himself they're necessary. Conquest does all of that and drops the pretense of necessity entirely. He does terrible things because he enjoys them, but the underlying logic of treating people as variables in an outcome equation is shared between them. A Mark trained by Conquest would have more in common with Cecil's operational mindset than the show's Mark does, and that's a deeply uncomfortable thing for the show's premise, because the show's Mark spends a significant amount of time pushing back against Cecil's calculus. He refuses to be an asset. He insists on his own judgment. He draws lines that Cecil keeps trying to redraw, and he draws them loudly with full awareness that Cecil has more institutional power and doesn't care. Like, that tension is one of the most productive things in the show. It forces both of them to be better than they'd be without the friction. Cecil keeps sliding toward treating everything as a calculation. Mark keeps sliding toward letting his feelings override his judgment. They push each other back toward the middle. Conquest-trained Mark is a Mark who's already been taught to think the way Cecil thinks, just without the institutional framework and with a lot more power behind it. The argument Cecil would make to justify a hard call would land differently on someone who spent 6 months learning that the outcome defines the right path. The version of Mark who argues loudest with Cecil in the actual show is arguing from a place of instinctive moral resistance. Conquest-trained Mark would argue from a place of rival calculation. That's a different conversation, and it produces a different Cecil, one who has to work a lot harder to justify himself to someone who's already using the same logic. Whether that's better or worse for either of them depends on which argument wins. Here's the part that's easy to miss though. Conquest is a terrible teacher in one specific and important way. He can train someone to fight. Can't train someone to lead. He has no interest in it and no capacity for it. Leadership requires the ability to think about what other people need from you. Conquest doesn't operate that way. He operates from a position of what he can extract, what the fight requires, what the mission demands. The people around him are either obstacles or tools. There's no third category. This is visible in everything he does during the training. He pushes Mark on technique, on output, on the willingness to finish what he starts. He says nothing useful about what Mark is supposed to do after the fight. Ask him what the GDA owes the people it protects, and he has nothing. Ask him what Mark should do when winning a fight makes things worse for the people who live there, and he has nothing. Everything stops at the fight for conquest. What comes after isn't his problem. And Mark, who was raised by a woman who cared very deeply about what things were for, notices. The entire time, Conquest is pushing Mark to be more efficient and less sentimental. He's also showing him exactly what that end point looks like. Conquest is the loneliest being in the known universe by his own admission. He told Mark during their actual fight in Season 3 that other Viltrumites fear him, that he has no name, only a function, that the thing he's best at has made him into something nobody wants to be around. He said it without self-pity, without anger, without any apparent awareness that it should bother him more than it does. He was describing a reality he accepted so long ago that the acceptance itself is just part of who he is now. In a training context, that comes through constantly. Conquest doesn't have conversations. He has assessments. He doesn't ask Mark how he's doing or what he's finding hard or what he wants his life to look like. Those aren't questions that fit inside the frame Conquest operates from. He pushes, he evaluates, he corrects, and he leaves. The relationship has no texture outside of Mark's combat output. Mark, even a version of Mark who's been absorbing Conquest's tactical lessons for 6 months, is not going to absorb that particular outcome as a goal. He's 17 years old, and his whole life has been about connection, about the people around him, about figuring out who he is through the relationships that see him clearly. The loneliness Conquest describes isn't a cautionary tale Conquest intends to tell. It's not something he's offering as a warning. He'd probably find the idea that Mark should feel sorry for him baffling, but it is the cautionary tale Mark hears. Every session, every time Conquest talks about the mission without mentioning anyone it's supposed to serve, every time Mark asks a question that has a human dimension and Conquest answers only the tactical part. The endpoint of Conquest's philosophy is standing right in front of him, and it has no name and no one who wants to be near it. There's a version of this training arc where Mark gets faster, stronger, and more tactical, but where the thing that saves him is the same thing that saves him in the actual show. The refusal to become what the system around him is building toward. Nolan's system tried to make him a weapon. Conquest's system tries to make him a more efficient version of that weapon. And Mark repeatedly, frustratingly, and sometimes at enormous personal cost refuses. The difference is that a Conquest-trained Mark refuses later and from a harder position. The habits are deeper, the tactical coldness has more time to set in before the experiences that push back against it. It would take longer for him to find his way back to the version of himself that makes him worth watching. The most interesting version of this isn't the one where Conquest ruins Mark. It's the version where Mark takes everything Conquest taught him, the speed, the efficiency, the understanding of what a fight costs and what it takes to win one, and uses all of it in service of who he is. The show's Mark eventually beats Conquest with no working arms through pure refusal to stop. A Conquest-trained Mark beats him differently. He beats him cleanly, efficiently, using the techniques Conquest himself installed, and then he makes the choice Conquest never could. He stops. He stops because he decided to. Somewhere in 6 months of being told that stopping is weakness, Mark found the one argument Conquest couldn't counter. The fact that choosing when to stop is the only thing that separates a warrior from a weapon. Conquest, who has been a weapon for 5,000 years, never learned that. Mark, who watched what it cost Nolan to be a weapon for 20, was never going to forget it. That version of Mark, shaped by Conquest's lessons but not defined by them, is probably the most dangerous version of Mark in any timeline. He'd be ahead of schedule on the power. More importantly, he'd know exactly what he could do, and think harder than any other version of himself about what he should do. With Conquest's training, Mark might truly be invincible in a near literal sense. Bone-chilling, isn't it? Subscribe to be here when Season 5 drops.